Hello and welcome to tonight's event. Thank you very much for coming out. The South China Sea is arguably the most important body of water in the world and has been a critical nexus or node of interaction in terms of people, ideas, goods, services, trade of all different kinds for at least 1,000 years. Yet, very often, we forget about it. It sort of disappears from the public discourse for long periods of time, only to be stirred up again more haphazardly at moments of particular crisis or conflict. And in recent months and years, we're seeing one of those moments of sort of sudden, intense interest in the South China Sea, but often without a lot of detail or subtlety in that public discourse. And so we hope to correct some of that this evening, where we have two august speakers to welcome. First up will be Laura Southgate, who is Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Studies at Aston University. And I invite her to present first.
Right. Oh, well, thank you very much, Bill. It's nice to be here. So what I'm going to be talking about is taking sort of like a micro look rather than a macro look at the South China Sea dispute, paying particular focus to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, so ASEAN, and also China. And for those who are unfamiliar potentially with ASEAN, I won't go into too much detail now because obviously quite time constrictions. But for those unfamiliar, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations is a 10-member regional organisation in Southeast Asia, which is mainly focused on political and economic regional cooperation. It's established in '67, so it's a very well-established association. And many of its members are at the forefront of this dispute, either directly engaged with China in territorial disputes in the South China Sea, or also have an interest in security in the South China Sea more broadly in terms of maritime security. And as Bill just touched on Southeast Asia's maritime domain is really of critical regional and international significance to the states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And that's because ASEAN states are really highly dependent on the waters of South China Sea for subsistence, for trade, for transport, and for their security as well. So I've included some sort of basic facts there around why that is. So it's very rich in gas and oil, and it's also rich in terms of fishing and fishery, which is of importance for the littoral states of Southeast Asia. And many of the ASEAN member states share a coastline with the South China Sea. So I think there's 7 altogether states of the 10 members who border the South China Sea. Not all of those are involved in the dispute, however. So particularly Vietnam and the Philippines are more at the forefront of ASEAN with regards to the South China Sea disputes, although it does also impact Brunei and Malaysia as well. And so what I want to discuss as part of my discussion around ASEAN and China is just to really consider what is ASEAN's maritime strategy, what is China's maritime strategy in the South China Sea. And in doing so, I want to kind of address these two questions, which is how effective is ASEAN at managing this dispute, essentially? And then more broadly from that is ASEAN able to uphold regional order in the region, essentially? How well has it done so far, and what are some of the challenges that it faces? So that's what I'll be discussing for the rest of the discussion. So to touch on what China's intentions in the South China Sea are, Xi Jinping has been quite open about the intentions for China in the South China Sea, essentially. So in 2017, he stated, as a direct quote, that the intention is to pursue a coordinated land and marine development, really to make China into a strong maritime power, a strong maritime country. And that's because obviously previously in China's history, it's mainly been focused on land power due to its landmass and the number of borders it shares with other countries. But it's looking to expand from there to become a maritime power. And China has increasingly vocalized sovereignty rights to all of the territory that falls within the 9-dash line region. So put a map on there to show that 9-dash line, which it first articulated in 1946. So essentially, China claims historic rights to all of the territory within the 9-dash line. And you'll see on the map how that conflicts with the exclusive economic zones of a number of Southeast Asian states. And you'll see in the middle the disputed islands that are part of this wider dispute in the Spratlys and the Paracels as well. So while these disputed islands have very little land value, they are very rich in maritime resources. And for both China, it's important, therefore, for both China as a national interest and also the states of ASEAN. It's also geostrategically located. China is in dispute with Vietnam over the Paracel and Spratly Islands, and the Spratly Islands are subject to a number of conflicting disputes with China between the Philippines, Taiwan, and also Malaysia as well. And what we've seen but particularly since 2013, is an extensive campaign of land reclamation and military construction by China in these disputed islands. So China has constructed military bases, installed missiles, built runways. There's a surface-to-air missiles on Woody Island in the Paracels. Aircraft hangars have been installed in Mischief Reef, for example, as well. So we've also gradually seen China using power or force to vocalize and to actionalize these different claims as well. And what we've seen is China increasingly using its Whitehall Coast Guard vessels for maritime law enforcement in the region. And so some statistics there, China's quadrupled its Coast Guard since 2013. It has 6 to 8 warships in the Indian Ocean at any given time as well. So in 2018, the China Coast Guard came under command of the People's Armed Police Force. And then from 2021, new legislation came into effect that gives the Chinese Coast Guard provision to forcibly evict foreign military vessels that commit what it deems as being illegal acts in maritime areas under its jurisdiction. And so from 2013 to 2023, we have seen China increasingly militarizing vessels in the region. So it has militarized fishing vessels, steel-hulled fishing vessels, for example. So this has sometimes been referred to as China's maritime militia. These vessels are ostensibly there for fishing purposes, but they often operate alongside Chinese law enforcement and the military to actionalize sovereignty claims in the region. So we see China engaging in these what are referred to as grey zone tactics. So essentially they are tactics and actions that remain below key escalatory thresholds in a quest to gain strategic advantage over others without necessarily tipping into conflict and war. So these vessels often operate in the exclusive economic zone of claimant states as well, and we see dangerous activities such as blocking and ramming of vessels of the Filipino fishing boats, for example, Vietnamese fishing boats as well, which is where we see some of these different types of escalatory actions occurring in the region. ASEAN has a variety of different platforms and frameworks and policies from which it looks to address these different maritime security challenges. So some of these you may be familiar with. It has the ASEAN Regional Forum, which is a security dialogue forum for ASEAN states and numerous external powers, including China and the United States. The ASEAN Defence Ministers meeting, it does have a maritime forum. Although that's not exclusively focused around just the South China Sea dispute. So it looks at piracy in the region, organised crime, the East Asia Summit, and more recently the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which is a new framework as well. And so these different frameworks, the aim is to engage in dialogue around maritime challenges, to provide a platform for confidence building between different ASEAN member states and ASEAN member states and external powers. It's important to note that these forums act on the guiding principles of the ASEAN Way. The ASEAN Way is a diplomatic style that ASEAN adopts, which is focused around confidence building, for example, consensus seeking amongst members rather than majority voting. And the focus is also particularly on ASEAN centrality in the Indo-Pacific as well. So, for example, the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, it promotes ASEAN centrality as a means of enhancing cooperation, promoting peace and stability, and trying to use ASEAN mechanisms to tackle different challenges that arise in the region. ASEAN is also focused on trying to implement a legal framework that directly looks to, alleviate tensions in the South China Sea. So this is the implementation of a code of conduct. So ASEAN and China, they already have agreed a non-binding declaration on the conduct of parties in the South China Sea in 2002, so over 20 years ago. It's not legally binding, uses the guiding principles of the ASEAN Way to try to ameliorate tensions in the South China Sea with China. Since 2002, the aim has been for ASEAN to try and make this law legally binding, to try to implement some different rules in the region that will prevent tensions, prevent conflict, that are in accordance with international law. Now, China has been very reluctant to be drawn into a legally binding code of conduct by ASEAN. So these negotiations have been going on for over 20 years. There still isn't a legal code that has been implemented for numerous different reasons, partly because China doesn't want to be drawn into a legally binding agreement. There's disagreements about what the scope of a code of conduct should be, how would it be enforced, who by, restrictions on militarization. So there's lots of dispute areas around this. And since the signing of the DOC, the declaration, the non-binding declaration in 2002, China has gone on to just reclaim more than over 3,000 acres of land in the region while these discussions have been going on. More recently, we've seen a focus by ASEAN on maritime law enforcement. An ASEAN Coast Guard Forum was established by Indonesia in 2002 with a focus on trying to strengthen maritime security. And we also saw in 2023 that ASEAN held its first joint military exercise hosted by the Indonesian National Armed Forces, which was referred to as called the ASEAN Solidarity Exercise, looking to enhance interoperability and cooperation amongst ASEAN member states with regards to maritime security. That was quite significant because it didn't have any external states, any external partners in that exercise, which was the first in its history. They initially wanted to have the exercise run in the South China Sea. However, Cambodia vetoed it running in the South China Sea for fear of antagonising China. So the exercise was moved in the end. Moving on from ASEAN as an institution, ASEAN's member states have also adopted their own initiatives to try to tackle the South China Sea dispute. So we've seen Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, they've increasingly focused on enhancing their own maritime law enforcement capabilities, particularly with a focus on coast guards again. Vietnam in 2013, it renamed its marine police the Vietnamese Coast Guard, and that's become quite an important factor in its maritime military strategy in the region. Similarly, the Philippines administration is looking to empower white hulls and coast guards to try to respond to China's actions in the South China Sea. So this is a way of trying to diversify capabilities in the region. So some of you will also be familiar that the Philippines launched a legal bid against China at the Permanent Court of Arbitration. So disputed proceedings there under the UNCLOS, United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So that was in 2013. The Philippines was hoping that UNCLOS would be able to resolve the maritime dispute and address who has maritime rights in the region, for example. In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration did rule in favour of the Philippines, finding that China had no historic rights to territory in the region. But since 2016, not very much has been essentially been put aside because of the Duterte government's which was in power at the time, which essentially adopted an appeasement policy with China from 2017 onwards in favour of economic interdependence with China. And then the member states also have numerous external partnerships with external powers with an interest in the South China Sea as well. I won't go into detail about that because it might touch on what Ralf potentially will cover, and also I'm happy to discuss it just as part of the wider discussion. So what are some of the obstacles to dispute resolution? ASEAN's attempts to prioritise maritime security have been undermined by a number of, sort of institutional challenges, but also external challenges as well. And I would argue it's kind of hampered its progress towards greater cooperation. So first of all, there is generally weak intra-ASEAN unity on the South China Sea dispute. So, for example, Vietnam and the Philippines are very concerned about actions in the South China Sea dispute because they're almost at the front line of ASEAN with regards to the territorial dispute. So it's in their national interest to want to have a resolution to this. And they view China as a threat in the region. However, not all ASEAN states view China as a threat. Not all ASEAN states even have coastline in the South China Sea. So, for example, Cambodia is closely aligned with China, Laos is closely aligned with China. So they have different national interests, different threat perceptions, and that means that overall there hasn't been a kind of united front in ASEAN to tackle this. We also see as well, which I think is quite significant, that all of the ASEAN states are quite reliant on China economically, so they're economically interdependent with China. Some to greater degrees than others. So obviously China and Cambodia, China and Laos have a very close integrated, interdependent relationship there. But even Vietnam, for example, and the Philippines are economically linked with China. And so that means that there's fears of antagonising and upsetting China too much. Moving on, I would argue that some of these ASEAN-centric security frameworks and forums and policies are ineffective, essentially. So due to the ASEAN way and due to a preference for dialogue and consensus seeking, I think it means that ASEAN regionalism can be quite slow. It can be quite ineffective. And that means that it's found it difficult to address these sort of more intractable sovereignty dispute challenges. And this has paved the way for new security platforms, external security platforms that have moved into the region and that look to sideline the association as well, such as AUKUS. But again, I won't touch on that because I think Ralf might touch on that as well. So ultimately, states are quite wary of exacerbating security competition in the region. They fear antagonising China and exacerbating tensions, but I think there's also fears of external powers and external actors of also exacerbating tensions in the region. From the Southeast Asian state perspective, they're very wary of sort of relying too much on external powers to try and sort of mitigate this the dispute, and becoming dependent on potentially unreliable allies who might pull out of the region for varying different domestic, or external reasons, and antagonising a military superior China. So that's a real concern for regional states. Similarly, things like use of coast guards for maritime law enforcement, that can also risk exacerbating conflict. It can strain state resources, and it places a strain on interagency cooperation as well. Ultimately, China is in a position of strength in the South China Sea, and it has been to date unwilling to compromise sovereignty in the region. So because of its superior military power and its unwillingness to compromise sovereignty, that has also obviously made this dispute resolution a major challenge. We do see that China is willing to cooperate in some maritime security areas with ASEAN and with ASEAN states. So, for example, in areas of humanitarian assistance, environmental protection. What we see there is really China looking to build soft power capital, willing to show that it is willing to cooperate with ASEAN and some of ASEAN's institutions and frameworks. But we also see that as a sort of dual track approach, because it's also coupled with this more hard power strategy in the South China Sea. So we did see, I think it was in 2023, that China ran a military maritime exercise in the South China Sea to deepen trust and cooperation with members of Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, Thai and Vietnamese forces. So there's some questions there about, has China been quite successful in potentially dividing ASEAN further on the South China Sea issue? So kind of looping back around to the weak intra-ASEAN unity. So concluding thoughts, if I come back to those questions that I wanted to sort of address, how effective is ASEAN's security architecture, and is ASEAN able to uphold regional order? I think I would argue that ASEAN maritime security is under increasing threat in the South China Sea. ASEAN's weak unity and the divisions, the inability, to date at least, to agree a binding code of conduct have undermined attempts to strengthen security in the region. We also see that the ASEAN way of conflict resolution, it can leave itself vulnerable to external pressures, and we see that particularly how China has been able to undermine the association in some respects. So we do see a degree of weakness at times with regards to ASEAN institution. There are intra-ASEAN bilateral tensions, and also this kind of increasing competition between ASEAN and some of the and China and some of the ASEAN member states, which has continued to hamper security cooperation in the region. And this has kind of driven ASEAN's littoral states to try to pursue their own national strategies, so more bilateral, minilateral, and individual strategies as well. And indeed looking externally to outside powers to see if they can help to resolve the conflict. The China's dual track strategy, which I just touched on, it's been quite successful in just sort of undermining a coordinated ASEAN maritime security strategy. ASEAN's persistence in trying to focus more on kind of dispute resolution and conflict resolution hasn't been effective to date, at least. So ultimately, I would argue that ASEAN's ability to uphold maritime security is contested still. It remains contested. And Southeast Asia remains a site of security competition as well. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. Next up we have Ralf Emmers, who is Associate Professor of International Relations and I believe co-director of the Centre of International Studies and Diplomacy at SOAS, University of London. He's going to talk to us about broader, big picture issues in the South China Sea as well.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking you, Bill and CK, for your very kind invitation and for all the arrangements. And I hope, very nicely build on what Laura has been focusing on, because while the South China Sea continues to be predominantly a dispute, a bilateral dispute across various claimants in Southeast Asia and China, with ASEAN trying to moderate tensions and come up with a code of conduct, it also increasingly has a wider geopolitical consideration. And this has basically been the case since roughly 2010, 2012, where suddenly the South China Sea is no longer just an issue between China and the various Southeast Asian claimant countries, but an issue which is very much on the minds of the United States, Japan, India, but also increasingly European powers, the UK and France. And for those of you who followed the news earlier today, the French just announced that they would participate in annual exercises held between the Americans and the Philippines. So the South China Sea has basically become internationalized, and this has happened roughly around the time of Xi Jinping's arrival in China, and also, of course, the time when the United States decided to determine and define the South China Sea as a national interest for the US. So what's at stake essentially is that the South China Sea is part of a wider contested regional order, where it is a contested order structured around the well-known hub and spoke system that we know since the 1950s, which is coexisting with a rising China-centric regional economy. And mutual perceptions of mistrust. On the one hand, the Americans wondering why the Chinese are so rapidly building their military capabilities, especially in the maritime domain, and especially when it comes to the Southern Fleet, which is based in Hainan. And the Chinese, of course, wondering why there is a need to preserve what looks like a Cold War containment system structured around a series of bilateral alliances. So you could argue that the South China Sea is part of a broader story around alternative regional orders which might be emerging in the Indo-Pacific, with the Southeast Asian countries sticking to the mantra of please don't force us to choose. We want to be partners and friends both with the United States as well as with China, which makes perfect sense. The Southeast Asian countries fully realize that their future, especially in economic terms, depends on China, while their future in security terms very much depends on the United States. So what I would invite you to do, therefore, is to look at the South China Sea as part of a continuum of regional flashpoints reaching to the north, especially when it comes to the maritime disputes that we have in the East China Sea involving China and Japan, the importance, of course, of the Taiwan question with the Taiwan Straits in particular, and the South China Sea. And so increasingly, all those areas, all those different disputes are regarded increasingly as one larger security complex. So the South China Sea, and here I can move reasonably quickly because Laura touched on most of them. What are the drivers of the dispute? Obviously, the natural resources, the area is rich in oil and gas, fisheries, but I would argue that that is not a sufficient factor to explain why the issue has flared up. Because ultimately, they could have reached joint development agreements to try to collectively benefit from those resources. I would argue instead that what really matters a great deal would be, on the one hand, rising nationalistic sentiments that you see both in China, but also in a series of Southeast Asian countries, as well, obviously, as a changing distribution of power, which affects the strategic value of the South China Sea. As mentioned in the introduction, the South China Sea is pivotal for commercial shipping, but of course also it is the link ultimately between the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. So any form of restricted control over that area would have very substantial geopolitical circumstances. On top of that, the South China Sea highlights a changing distribution of power and how China, in contrast, of course, to the Southeast Asian countries, has been able to develop a very significant naval power in the region. These are a sense of the kinds of disputes, sovereignty and jurisdictional rights issues that we've seen since 2010. So there is that famous statement by Hillary Clinton, who at that point was Secretary of State, arguing at an ARF meeting in Hanoi that the South China Sea is now a national interest of the United States, while at the same time, of course, you have in China the emergence of a much more assertive position. So we've had a series of tensions, and those tensions, in fact, this slide is not completely up to date because those tensions are carrying on as we speak. And so once again, this point that it no longer just involves China and the various Southeast Asian countries, although of course that continues, and that continues to be at the core of the sovereignty disputes, but it also is of immediate interest to user states. And from what I'll do for the rest of my presentation is to focus very much on the user states, the ones who do not have claims in the South China Sea, but who feel that they have an immediate interest in that area. Having said that, let me of course start with China, which is a claimant country, obviously. But what we have seen in China, and it remains a puzzle, why China has changed its behavior to that extent. Because for a very long time, China was relying on a very patient strategy of building trust and confidence and deeper economic relations with the Southeast Asian countries. And that meant, to a large extent, not escalating the situation too much in the South China Sea. There had been very significant skirmishes, especially with Vietnam, especially when Vietnam was not yet a member of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. But by 2010, what you see is China changing its position, becoming less patient, becoming more assertive, seeing deeper activities deep in the South China Sea, starting to militarize the reefs. And to a large extent, of course, creating nervousness in Southeast Asia, and therefore the Southeast Asian countries mostly therefore aiming further towards deepening their relations with the US. So that shift, I think, in Chinese policy is something that we may want to address in the Q&A. What China clearly continues to do, of course, is to argue that the South China Sea should not be internationalized. It's not an issue that should be of any interest to outside powers. The Chinese would often argue it's the external powers, and predominantly the United States, which has complicated the situation on the ground. We can reach a deal with the Southeast Asian countries, but as mentioned by Laura, that has not actually materialized despite 20 odd years of code of conduct negotiations. The other element which continues to characterize Chinese behavior is, of course, not wanting to rely on UNCLOS, the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention, in trying to manage or even perhaps resolve the issue, relying instead on historical claims. And we all remember that China decided not to participate in the Permanent Arbitration Court case that the Philippines decided to bring to the PCA. So what about the United States? And the United States, as we should remember, is not a claimant country. It is not in any way suggesting that it is taking a position by pushing forward some of its own claims. The US interest in the South China Sea, however, are twofold. On the one hand, it's all about the freedom of navigation principle. And the freedom of navigation is, of course, associated with commercial shipping, but no one expects China to undermine commercial shipping in the South China Sea. That would ultimately undermine its own economic interests. The bigger issue is when it comes to the freedom of navigation of military ships and aircrafts, and what type of military activity that an external power like the United States can conduct in the South China Sea. The second major interest of the United States is actually its own credibility. The Philippines is an ally of the United States, so ultimately it wants to be perceived as a credible ally. The idea that the US would not be viewed as such could then undermine its credibility in the wider region. But of course, Manila is well aware of this, and there is always the risk of what we call alliance entrapment, where the Philippines may take the United States where it doesn't want to go. Because ultimately, of course, the United States does not want a conflict with China over isolated rocks. So it's constantly having to manage wanting, on the one hand, to be a credible ally of the Philippines, but on the other, making sure that actions on the ground do not spiral out of control. And then, of course, those, I would argue, are the two major interests of the US. And people argue that we have seen a change in US position. The US used to not take a position on the claims. They would argue we are not claiming that China is right or that Vietnam is right, and so on and so forth. Some people, especially international lawyers, are trying to say that this has actually changed and that the US is now, especially since the Chinese rejection of the PCA decision in 2016, arguing very clearly from its State Department that the Chinese claims in the South China Sea cannot be squared under international law, and that therefore it is not in any way something that China can hope to implement. What we have seen, therefore, is since the Obama administration, the United States conducting freedom of navigation operations, which are basically US aircrafts and vessels navigating those disputed waters coming very close to what the Chinese would argue are sovereign territories with the maritime zones that they generate, sailing through them, saying, no, those are international waters, they are not Chinese waters, and hence we are in a position to conduct those operations. And what's very interesting is that you have seen actually great continuity across Obama, Trump, and the Biden administration. In fact, some people would have expected perhaps Trump to change the position, but in fact, he enhanced the number of FONOPs, but did certainly not change the policy, and so did Biden. And the jury is out. Some people are saying that such operations actually escalate tensions on the ground and that there is a real risk of accidents. Others are saying it's very important that such operations are conducted. What's interesting is that the US has not been able to rely on any of its allies to join those FONOP operations. The Australians, the Japanese conduct similar activities in the South China Sea, but will not refer to them as FONOPs and will not do them together with the US. So let me quickly touch on two other user states. Japan. So Japan is a country with great interest in the South China Sea, partly because 83% of its total energy actually sails through the South China Sea and 20% of its global trade. But more importantly for Japan, Tokyo regards the South China Sea as an extension of Chinese behavior in the East China Sea, where it does have claims, overlapping claims with China. So Tokyo looks very carefully at what China does in the South China Sea, reflecting on what this means in terms of its own behavior in the East China Sea. So what we have seen in recent years is Japan further developing what is already a very sizable naval capability, expanding its presence in the South China Sea through capacity building exercises and capacity building, providing vessels and so on, especially to the Philippines. And of course, you've seen a rapid acceleration of Japanese activities together with the US, Australia, and the Philippines, because ultimately Japan is looking at the South China Sea as a test to the rule-based order, very much fostered by the United States. India, however, is taking a slightly different approach. India, again, very dependent on the South China Sea for a series of reasons: international trade that crosses the South China Sea, access to the East Asian and North American markets. India, as you know, also has a land dispute with China, which went through a process of escalation in recent years. And again, India looks at the South China Sea as yet another test of how China may behave in other parts of Asia, in the Indian Ocean, but also in its immediate land dispute on its northern border. India projects power in the South China Sea, but does it in a very different way from Japan. It does not want to collaborate its efforts through the Quad, for instance, the Quad that brings together Japan, India, Australia, and the United States. Instead, it wants, shall we say, to do its own way. It's a view of order which to some extent diverges from the US and Japan, where it seeks to balance China without becoming a quasi-ally of the United States or accepting leadership of the United States in the South China Sea. Now, very briefly, and I'll end on that, how are the two major claimants in Southeast Asia responding to this geopolitical game? Vietnam on the one hand and the Philippines on the other. So Vietnam is in this incredibly tricky situation of being very dependent on China economically, but having overlapping claims with China in the South China Sea and having to hedge that position at any given point. You may have noticed a few months last year, Hanoi welcomed both Xi Jinping and President Biden, which was an incredible diplomatic coup of being able to hedge its relations by having both leaders visit Hanoi within a couple of months. But it is also a very hard position to sustain, where it constantly needs to make sure that it is not coming too close to one or the other. But as far as the South China Sea is concerned, Vietnam certainly wants to see the internationalization of the dispute. It wants to see as many American vessels in the region as possible. And symbolically, it has, of course, opened Cam Ranh Bay to US vessels. Cam Ranh Bay, which was the main American naval base during the Vietnam War. Philippines, finally, it very much depends on who is the president. If you have President Duterte, you see a switch closer to Vietnam, to China. Currently, under President Marcos, you see a very rapid acceleration of relations with the US, a deepening of the alliance, where you could argue increasingly that the Philippines is no longer hedging its bets, but at the moment, at least, putting most of its bets in the US camp. So to conclude, the South China Sea is certainly and remains predominantly a dispute between all the claimant countries, but it also has a wider geopolitical component where user states are directly involved. The China-US relationship is at the core of that story, especially its rivalry, and it leaves the South China Sea as still unlikely to flare up into an open conflict, but still a major flashpoint between relations where the risk of accidents remains significant. And I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you both, Laura and Ralf, for excellent presentations. Before I open up to questions and wider discussion, I just want to say, building on the presentations, one thing, which is that it is notable that there is a long period of time in which the South China Sea did not become a major point of conflict between these particular states, right? That from the time that China first, under the Republic of China, Kuomintang government in 1946, articulated the 9-line claim, right? The other allies at the end of World War II did not push back against that claim. And the new government in China after 1949, the CCP government, also did not change the claim particularly, right? And then we see this time throughout the 1950s and 60s where China tried to kind of play diplomacy with Southeast Asian states by promising to change the claim depending on what those countries' reactions to China might be, but it didn't really have much of an effect. The last thing to note about this is that the Southeast Asian states that then later articulated claims, in 1946, most of them did not have independence, right? And as those states gained independence in the years following World War II, up to about 1965, they then staked claims that are quote-unquote normal or run-of-the-mill ordinary claims under general principles of the law of the sea about territorial waters and exclusive economic zones and so on. Those claims then overlap with the 9-line claim that China had articulated before. But still no one really seemed to fight about it, and not much. I mean, Vietnam and China have a particular conflict history in the 1970s and 80s. But other than that, there isn't really fighting over this until the 1990s. So I mean, for 50 years, essentially, nobody really fought over this. But then in the 90s, we start seeing all the artificial islands beginning to be built and reefs being built upon and so on. And also, interestingly, at that moment, I think for other reasons, a hardening of positions by the US vis-a-vis maritime security, not just in South China Sea, but also East China Sea, Taiwan, Korea, all kinds of other areas where the US takes an interest in East Asian, Southeast Asian security. So I think we see this kind of slow roll creep after the early to mid 90s, after this long period of non-conflictual relationships over this particular issue, despite lots of conflict in Southeast Asia during the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, all this time, but very little about the South China Sea per se, until this sort of slow roll begins, after which I would agree by about 2010, we see then a step change from several sides into a higher level of tension. So with that, if anyone has questions to pose, there should be a microphone coming around. Yes, no.
I'm curious how comparable the disputes China's had with its land neighbors versus the maritime disputes have been. The fact that they did fight a border war with the Soviets and then managed to resolve the Russian border. If there are any lessons from that, or if they're just qualitatively completely different.
Well, that's a very interesting puzzle because China has actually managed to resolve most of its land borders, with some exceptions, India being the pivotal one. When it comes to maritime disputes, it managed to come up with a solution of its dispute with Vietnam in the Bay of but not in the South China Sea context. And so many people are wondering, why is China able to do it on its land borders, but not when it comes to its maritime borders? And this is where the East China Sea comes to mind and the South China Sea comes to mind. The story that I told could be part of the explanation. And that's definitely the explanation that the Chinese are giving, which is like, well, when you leave us deal with our neighbors directly, we actually are willing to make significant concessions. And for instance, that is the case of its agreement with Vietnam, where actually many people argued that the Chinese were quite generous. They would argue it's when external powers come to complicate things and raise the geopolitical tension that makes it much, much harder to do. So that's usually the story you would hear from Beijing. But that is definitely worth studying in great detail. What explains this discrepancy between what China is willing to do on its land borders, with the exception of India, and what it's willing to concede in the maritime domain?
Hi, thanks very much for this great presentation. My question, I guess, is for everyone. I guess, would you care to speculate what this all means for the structure of ASEAN going forward? Because it's striking to note that yesterday we had a presentation by Professor Kong Yin-Fong, who basically said we're talking about Southeast Asia here. ASEAN as a coherent entity just doesn't make any sense. And that seems to come true in the presentations as well. We're talking about Philippine national interests, talking about Vietnam national interests, but it's very difficult, as Professor Laura Southgate said, to talk about a coherent interest for ASEAN. So what does this mean? Could we see a fracturing of ASEAN, or would it be a spur for some sort of reform, which I think recently actually Bilahari Kausikan actually called for? So I just wanted to know what we all think about this.
I mean, it's a good question. I think there's been calls for ASEAN reform for a long time now. I mean, especially since the end of the Cold War, and since the 1990s, there's been criticism constantly leveled at ASEAN that it's a talk shop. You often hear it's just a talk shop. Nothing gets done. They meet and they talk, and things get swept under the carpet. And that's a criticism that's continued for quite a long time, and yet, obviously there hasn't actually been reform in that time. So obviously the South China Sea dispute is a major issue that's challenging ASEAN at the moment, but it's not the only issue that ASEAN deals with. And it's dealt with numerous challenges, over the past 20 to 30 years. And you generally see quite a reluctance to change the model that they have. And I think that's because, whilst I was obviously quite negative in many respects about ASEAN and its ability to tackle this type of dispute, ASEAN supporters would argue that ASEAN isn't a security arrangement. It's not an alliance. Its aims and objectives have never been to tackle security challenges. It's not one of its aims and objectives. Similarly, you could also point out that really the aim of ASEAN was regional economic growth, which it's been very successful at, and to prevent conflict between its member states, which used to have a history of conflict. And you could also argue it's been very successful at that as well. So whilst an ASEAN skeptic might point out that it doesn't seem to be able to tackle these challenges, and so we need reform, somebody who support an ASEAN supporter would argue, well, look, what ASEAN does, it does quite well, so it doesn't necessarily need to reform. So personally, I don't think we're going to see reform anytime soon, because I think it works for the ASEAN states. I think that's why the likes of Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam are members of ASEAN, because of the ASEAN way and the ASEAN style, Myanmar as well. but then I don't think I wouldn't really expect to see a fracture of ASEAN either. I personally think we'll probably just see ASEAN just continue to bumble along in the way it has done, and we'll probably just see more of these external arrangements, such as AUKUS, the Quad, developing to try and tackle challenges in the Indo-Pacific. That is an issue for ASEAN, I think, and for ASEAN centrality, but I don't know whether it necessarily means that it would fracture the association.
If I could build on that as well, I think the code of conduct is a fantastic example, because here is an attempt at the ASEAN plus one, or the way the Chinese call it, 1+10, to negotiate a code that would apply to Southeast Asia and the South China Sea. But of course, only 4 of the ASEAN countries actually have claims. So you can imagine that it generates tensions among the ASEAN 10 as well, because Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, they're saying, why are we going to jeopardize our very good relations with China over something to which we have no bone of contention with China? And so that then frustrates countries like Vietnam and the Philippines, who would like to have a much stronger code of conduct, but essentially are to some extent undermined by their own association, which is kind of saying, well, we don't want to go that far. You need to make compromises as well. And so then sometimes you have think tankers in Vietnam and the Philippines and others saying, well, perhaps we should just have a code of conduct with the claimants and exclude the others. But then China comes into the picture and say, no, we don't want that. We actually want everybody involved, because they realize that it's a very good way of weakening ASEAN from within. And so that's one example of what Laura was saying, is ASEAN is kind of trying to keep all of those things in balance. And you could argue perhaps not doing very well, but what's the alternative? If you don't have ASEAN in a code of conduct negotiation, then ultimately this asymmetry of power would become even greater to the advantage of China.
I think one other thing to remember about ASEAN too is that ASEAN, as I think Laura pointed out, it's never really been about a security arrangement, but it actually has done surprisingly well on a number of fronts, not only economic and social, but even security, if we expand what security means. I mean, ASEAN has provided a useful platform for dealing with security issues like transnational crime and terrorism, even things like pandemic control were handled in some cases not by ASEAN actively, but using ASEAN as a forum for coordination on some of these things quite well. I think where there's a real problem for ASEAN, or weakness, a systemic or structural weakness of ASEAN, is in managing great power interests in the region. Right? Because ASEAN region is notable for not having on the ground an actual sort of global great power in the region. Right? None of the ASEAN states even claims to be a global great power. Indonesia may imagine that it is in some ways, but it's not. Right? It's not even really the regional hegemon that it sometimes asserts itself to be. Right? So I think the fact that there's no great power in the region helps all of the different states to balance one another, but it also makes it very difficult for them to coordinate when external great powers want to become involved. And we've seen that really since the inception. And so if it's the US or China or Japan or India or any other big power from outside, it's difficult to line up a coalition because the states don't all agree on how to relate to that power. And we've talked a bit about China and how Laos and Cambodia and Myanmar and other countries are very differently disposed towards China than a country like the Philippines or Vietnam would be. But the same is true if we think about the US or Australia or Japan or any of them, right? That different ASEAN member states will have very different views on how to relate to those countries and split rather sharply in many cases about that. John, Hugo, and over there. So we'll go across.
Thanks for 2 really interesting presentations. You mentioned the question of US credibility and also continuity between Obama, Trump, and Biden. Looking ahead to November, in the event that Donald Trump were to win, does that change that calculation or that assessment about US credibility? Because we've seen all the big changes in the Republican Party when it comes to America's international posture. We've seen Donald Trump doubling down on his much more transactional approach to traditional allies. But in the case of the Southeast Asian region and the South China Seas, presumably the economics dictates that the United States needs to stay engaged, it needs to feel that it has access. Do you expect, first of all, any change if Trump were to win? And what is the perception of individual ASEAN members when it comes to sustaining US engagement in the region?
Maybe let's take a bank of the three questions and then we can answer all of them. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you both. That was fascinating. I spend my time partly thinking about where things could go wrong, and I was curious if you could both outline what an escalatory spiral beginning in the South China Sea might look like. What might trigger it? How might it grow? And how might it then spiral into involving active great power competition, if not conflict? So, I mean, we've talked a lot about the region and its dynamics now. What would an escalatory spiral beginning in this region look like? And then I'll bring it across. There you go, mate.
Yeah, so I have two questions. The first question is in relation to how this South China Sea dispute would affect the strategic culture of both the US and China, and how that relates to the user states that were outlined earlier. The second question is in relation to the domestic politics, which I thought was outlined earlier. An example given was how the change in the leadership in Philippines actually affected the different sort of stance towards leaning to either the US or to China. So I was wondering if the reverse has also been the case. So has the South China Sea dispute, has it affected domestic politics? Has it sort of affected how leaders are appointed, public sentiment, and how that has affected broader society in general? Thanks.
Okay. So first, I'm glad that dementia is not started yet in my brain. I was referring to the Bay of Bengal. The Bay of Tonkin. There we go. The Bay of Tonkin, and how China went for an equidistance agreement with Vietnam, which was actually quite generous to Vietnam. On Trump, I think the Trump administration, let's look first at the first Trump administration, which actually in Southeast Asia wasn't as disliked as it was in Europe. Because it was not focusing too much on human rights. It wasn't, and it was quite tough on China. And so that made it quite a general, and I wouldn't call it popular, but in Southeast Asia the sense was we can do business with him. And I think the danger that we see at the moment is that in some Southeast Asian capitals there is an understanding we'll be able to do business with Trump again. So if you're looking at the editorials of various Southeast Asian newspapers, they don't seem to be as worried about a Trump election in comparison perhaps to what we see here in Europe. I would argue, however, that we should be very worried because the reason why Trump continued to rely on FONOPs was basically because he had lots of grown-ups around him. And they were dealing with day-to-day policy. And it looks like a second Trump administration would not rely on grown-ups. I think all the grown-ups ended up either being fired or resigning before their term ended. And I would imagine that a second term of Trump would be much more focused around a very close group of friends and people who I don't think would lead to very good policy prescription for the South China Sea and Southeast Asia in general. So I think even last week there was the former dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy who gave a big speech and he said, "Oh, Europe is terrified by the potential Trump administration. We'll be fine because we'll deal with him." And I think that's actually that's a mistake because I think it would be a very different type of administration. That would be my guess. Very quickly on how would the situation spiral out of control? At SOAS, we just ran a crisis management exercise exactly on that. And it was quite simple. It starts with a fishery incident. We basically experienced it already back in 2012 where you had a fishery incident leading to the arrest of Philippine fishermen by China. And essentially the United States, under Obama at that point, decided to de-escalate the situation. And China very much then taking control over Scarborough Shoal, leading the Obama administration to lose some credibility. I think what could happen, if such an incident were to happen again, is that the United States would feel like, well, we need to do something because our credibility is on the line. So I would argue that it's likely to spiral out of control due to a very minor incident, probably involving fisheries and Chinese coast guards. That is probably what would trigger, I would argue, the situation. And then it wouldn't flare up into a major conflict, but it could flare up for a few days, and quite a lot could happen during those few days. And very, very briefly on domestic politics, yes, now if you look at the Marcos and the last presidential election in the Philippines, they had to speak to fishermen communities and saying, how are you going to defend how are you as a president going to defend our interest in the South China Sea? The same would be true increasingly in countries like Vietnam and like Malaysia as well. So it resonates in the sense that domestic leaders, and of course that's very true in China, where domestic leaders have to come out strong in not coming across as making any concessions. I'll stop here.
I agree with many of the points that Ralph's just touched on. With regards to another Donald Trump administration, personally, I would still expect the US to adopt quite a strong response, like a hawkish response towards China. I'd be surprised if they moved away from that policy. And I think that would be welcomed among the states, the Vietnam, the Philippines. But I also agree with what Ralf mentioned about, and I think this links in with this potential question about what might trigger a spiral or a conflict. I think there is the potential, as I agree, like something small, because obviously the US and the Philippines have their defense agreement. So the United States has been quite vocal and said, if the Philippines is attacked, then we will come to their aid, we will support you. So it could be something around there where there is something small that happens in the region, which then triggers potentially, the defense agreement. And with Donald Trump being Donald Trump and having potentially quite a hawkish policy towards China, they might go in guns blazing potentially, which I'd be less likely to think a Biden administration would probably do that. So there could be the potential for conflict around there. The question around sustaining US engagement in the region, I think this is a perpetual worry for the states, ASEAN member states, and ASEAN more broadly. If you read the State of Southeast Asia survey, which is released each year, I think actually one of the questions is who can ASEAN's trusted extra-regional powers be in the event of the United States being unreliable? So I think it's actually one of the questions. So I think there's always that fear with regards to the United States of, okay, now they're very focused and engaged. They have an Indo-Pacific policy, free and open strategy, a pivot. But then things happen elsewhere that move the US's attention. So obviously under Obama, you had Syria, Libya. Now currently, obviously, you've got Ukraine, the Middle East. So I think they're very wary of putting all their eggs in one basket with the United States, because I think they appreciate that the US isn't always necessarily, even if they appreciate that the US wants to be more involved, it might not always be able to be as involved as it says it will. And that's why you see it looking further afield to other extra-regional powers. So Japan, obviously Australia, India, increasingly the UK is now, you can see the UK being mentioned in these surveys as a potential trusted extra-regional power. So I think that there's, they're very aware of the fact that US engagement can't always be sustained. And so that has implications for them. And the question about domestic politics is a really good one. I remember under the Duterte government, there was constant criticisms about the policy that they took, the administration took, or he took, with regards to China, from within his own government, but also from fishermen, for example, as well. So it did impact public sentiment, and I think there was a strong vocal argument from the public and from some of the different policy actors, and that they were kowtowing to China, essentially, or allowing China to take the territory. So you do see that, and obviously the new administration's taken more of a hard line against China, which will be popular amongst some and less popular amongst others. So there is always that kind of going on at the domestic level, particularly.
Just to add a little bit on some of those points, I think Trump, in many ways, is the American Duterte, only perhaps less suave in some respects, at least. And so I think there's a great deal of uncertainty around what a Trump administration looks like. And I would actually emphasize a negative side for Southeast Asia that's not often mentioned, which is that Trump is a very bad ally. Or partner for allies, which is what much of the concern in Europe has been about. But I wouldn't minimize that in Asia either. Countries like Japan and Australia that have very strong alliances with the United States, as well as strong interests in the South China Sea region, wouldn't be able to count on Trump, I think, or at least they'd be afraid of not being able to count on Trump to the same extent that they have actually seen the alliance emphasized under the Biden administration. The Philippines, also directly in the region, and Vietnam, have also had diplomatic relationships and alliance relationships emphasized by Biden. I doubt that Trump would be as consistent in emphasizing, or at least that they would be confident in Trump's consistency of emphasizing those relationships. So while Trump might take a very hawkish stand in the region, it's unlikely that he would be as able or as interested in working with allies and partners in the region to advance even that hawkish aim. And that could leave the risks then multiplied. In terms of risk scenarios, I agree that a very small incident could quickly spiral, but let me add a couple of other possibilities. One would be kind of deliberate escalation that then cannot be stopped. So there's been talk in recent months about the possibility that the Philippines could invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty with the United States. If the Philippines invokes the treaty, what does that mean? Probably it means the US Navy escorting supply ships to Second Thomas Shoal. If that happens and the Chinese Coast Guard continues with water cannon and other deterrence techniques against those ships, what happens? Would the US naval vessels actually act against the Chinese Coast Guard vessels? If they did that, what happens then? Right? It would be very easy to imagine this escalating rather more rapidly than anybody intends, but that's still deliberate escalation. A second scenario would be an accident, which is the one that's often talked about, right? If one of those freedom of navigation B-52s crashes, for example, or planes collide, like the spy plane incident back in 2003, or not 2003, that was actually even longer ago than that, was 2001. Yeah, it was under Bush the Lesser, yes. It was in the first couple of months, this happened in April, and right after Bush had articulated on television in US TV that the US was going to set aside strategic ambiguity over Taiwan and would do anything necessary to protect Taiwan. Then the spy plane incident happens, and it really, that came close to an escalatory spiral to a degree that I think isn't often appreciated looking back at it. But something like that in the South China Sea could provoke a spiral of escalation that no one intends, and that just sort of happens. A third scenario would be miscalculation, that someone does something thinking they can get away with it, but they can't. Right. So if, for example, China decided they're going to seize another reef or another shoal or build something because no one will react, but then somebody does, whether that be the Philippines or the US directly or somebody else. Or Vietnam decides that they can build another rig or artificial island in the area that's well within the 9-dash line, and China won't do anything, but then they do. So there's that possible aspect of miscalculation as well. In terms of domestic politics, and we've talked a lot about the Philippines and Philippines domestic politics, and I would second all of that. I think it's really very important and very clear. But if we look at some other countries in the region too, right? This has been an actual electoral issue in Malaysia not that long ago, right? And there's been a back and forth between different political factions in Malaysia around not so much the South China Sea dispute per se or exclusively, but the general issue of relations with China. It's a major issue in political discourse right now in Indonesia, as President-elect Prabowo Subianto has reached out both to China and Japan, noticeably not to the United States, at least not directly in any clear way. And the pro-Prabowo people are talking about managing both sides and this sort of hedging strategy in order to achieve economic growth. But I think there's also a security dimension as well. And it's not clear exactly where Indonesia is going in terms of advancing its security interests via these outreach initiatives. But there could be an aspect of a shift in policy. Probably nothing like Duterte, even though people like to compare Prabowo and Duterte in other ways. I'm not sure that he's going to go quite so far as that. But it would be interesting. And certainly perceptions of the South China Sea dispute and of China generally are influencing that political dialogue inside Indonesia about Prabowo and the policies he's choosing. Where I think we also will see a lot of discussion around this are in those countries that have not taken a strong line consistently, either more towards China's side or more against China's side for the US side or whatever other side we want to say. Places like Thailand and Singapore and Malaysia to some extent, although Singapore and Malaysia are very much in a US camp for many things, not always vis-a-vis these relationships with China. And in those countries, I think there could be a lot of domestic political contestation around this to a degree that people often, frankly, forget. Just as they forgot in much of the rest of the world about differences in the Philippines between different governments. And many people reacted with surprise when Marcos came in with a very different policy than Duterte, just as they reacted with surprise when Duterte came in with a very different policy from his predecessors. So it's not a surprise, it was in their manifestos. Right, in all of their campaign materials and all of their speeches, as was also the case in Malaysia before and in other countries. So shifts in policy vis-a-vis China are not necessarily a surprise if we understand the domestic politics of the countries involved. Sorry to go on so long about that. Any other questions?
Hi. So in the beginning, there was a brief mention of the hub and spoke security architecture. Assuming a trend of increased Chinese aggressiveness in the South China Sea, also regarding Taiwan, and I guess fork in the road election, maybe Trump or Biden presidency. Do you see any change in that framework, maybe towards an Asian NATO, so to speak, or would it? How do you see that kind of playing out over the long term?
I think I'm the one who mentioned the hub and spoke, so I'll give it a first try. This brings us to this very big debate of why is there no NATO in Asia? For this very well-read article by Katzenstein, which came out 20 years ago, and you've had people like Victor Cha writing a full book on it. I still don't think we are seeing the possibility of a real NATO in Asia. Some people, I think, are getting ahead of themselves with the Quad. You see the Quad already running out of steam when it comes to military issues, partly because India doesn't want to go in that area. And India is so significant and so important to the United States and Japan and Australia that they are willing to make that concession to India just to keep India on board and keeping India engaged. So now the latest media attraction is like, well, perhaps we'll have the equivalent, but we'll replace India by the Philippines, and we'll have the US, the Philippines, Australia, and Japan. I think we need to still make a distinction between what are minilaterals emerging in the region with a military cooperation dimension, joint exercises, to an Article 5 style multilateral arrangement in the region. And unless, and then of course, who knows, unless Chinese behavior would significantly change and become significantly more aggressive, I don't see that happening anytime soon, because most countries in the region continue to hedge their bets, continue to be very dependent on China economically, and they want to coexist with their immediate large neighbors. So I don't think we're moving in that direction. What's interesting, however, is the hub and spoke model has changed to some extent. It used to be a series of bilateral relationships, everything gearing towards Washington. What you now have is much closer collaboration between the spokes. Australia, Japan comes to mind. We've seen some interesting developments on the South Korea, Japan front, which people would not have expected a few years ago. But again, I would dissociate that from the emergence of a multilateralized defense alliance in the region. Again, unless hopefully we don't get there, but unless there is a very significant change in Chinese behavior.
Yeah, I think just to follow on from Ralph's comments, I also think it was very unlikely to see a sort of Asian NATO. Just thinking more specifically about the ASEAN member states, they've always been very vocal and very reluctant at joining these kind of arranged security alliances. So even if you look during the Cold War, for example, and obviously security then was compromised in the region. Member states were under threat because you had Vietnam acting in the region, Thailand was under threat, Cambodia was under threat, and so on. And even then, during the Cold War, there was a reluctance to involve themselves in anything that would be seen to be a proper security alliance. So if it didn't happen during the Cold War, it was unlikely to see it happen now. And I think all the member states are still quite vocal about not wanting to be drawn into those kinds of security arrangements for very different reasons. I mean, Indonesia's generally followed more of a kind of non-aligned, preference for non-alignment, but like India, for example. And I think still has some preferences for that. Similarly, Malaysia used to have a similar preference for, non-external interference in the region, preferring a regional solution to regional problems and so on. That doesn't extend as far as security alliances. And then you've got other member states with completely different threat perceptions who don't even see something like China as a threat at all. So they wouldn't be joining something like that. So because of those reasons, I think it's particularly unlikely, and what would be more likely to see are things such as the kind of like more minilateral agreements, more bilateralism between states, both within the region and with ASEAN states and external actors as well. I think that's probably much more likely. I think it would have to be something really cataclysmic for an Asian NATO to suddenly pop up. And it would probably, when we talked about ASEAN and could we ever see it being weakened, something like an Asian NATO would probably do it, I think, because it would completely undermine the unity. There is no real unity, but it would undermine the association.
I think if searching for the reason why there is no Southeast Asian NATO, look no further than the example of SEATO, right? I mean, that didn't go so well. So, as in the Cold War example, that doesn't really work. So, I think I'd be very surprised also. CK, you get the last question by virtue of having been running around with the mic the whole time.
So thank you all for your presentations and all these fascinating discussions as well. So my question somewhat entails from what we just discussed and also touches on the recent development where we had the joint exercises in the South China Sea between the United States, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines, so these 4 countries. And technically it's about how would other Southeast Asian countries really see this kind of development. So in the sense as in Southeast Asia always wanted to, or ASEAN as a whole wanted to engage with external powers, but largely either economically or diplomatically, but not exactly militarily, right? And usually with South China Sea, they really wanted external powers support usually in terms of like rhetorically. So statements in support of Southeast Asian or ASEAN position on South China Sea rather than really being engaged with the region militarily. But now we're seeing, as we saw the development of this joint exercises, we are seeing more and more other regional powers being engaged militarily in the South China Sea, and obviously that could escalate into different scenarios, but how would other obviously this was something the Philippines really wanted to pursue, but how would other Southeast Asian countries really see this kind of development happening? And would this, of course, going back to earlier questions, undermine the ASEAN solidarity on this issue?
I think that, just to have a bit of a stab at the question, and then I'll move on, let Ralf pick it up. I think that, obviously, I think ASEAN states are quite wary sometimes about different joint exercises, which is why we saw Cambodia request that the ASEAN solidarity exercise be moved from outside the South China Sea, because I think there's concerns about how China will perceive this. Will it antagonise China? Will it upset the status quo? And these kind of concerns. I do think what you do tend to see with regards to these joint exercises is sometimes a focus on things like capacity building, interoperability. They might talk about working together training for, rather than being focused and aimed at China and how we can, have a joint military exercise that would tackle China. They tend to be more around, humanitarian disaster relief or, piracy, for example, as well. So I think sometimes the joint exercises of China will be watching what happens with them, but they use the language of other types of transnational security threat in the region to sort of prevent antagonizing China.
I fully agree. And just to add on, I think there is also always a bit of a difference between the public discourse and what is actually said behind closed doors. So publicly, countries like Indonesia, Malaysia would say, well, we want regional solutions to regional problems. We don't want people to come and flare up those situations. Officially, both countries were not very keen, for instance, on AUKUS. They're not keen on the Quad. But then behind closed doors, there is a sense kind of like, well, sure, it's maybe not a bad thing that you kind of are present in the region, because it reminds China that the issue has been internationalized, and it's not just them and us. It's also involving other parties. But I fully agree with Laura. It's also about the packaging. Like if those exercises were to take a more military edge and really be conducted in very clearly disputed waters, I think quite a few Southeast Asian countries may walk away and say this is not what we want, because we are going to ultimately become the area of dispute between China and the US, like the Balkans in the Southeast Asian context, which is precisely what the Southeast Asian countries have been trying to avoid since the formation of ASEAN in 1967. The idea, please do it elsewhere. We want to try to promote security through socioeconomic development and other means. So it's all a question of degree, and I think the US is well aware of it. So is Japan. That it's a question of how far you can go before you start antagonizing. Because as what Laura was saying before, we should not forget that there are many different strategic outlooks in Southeast Asia, and very different threat perceptions in Southeast Asia. And quite a few regional countries do not see China as a threat at all. They see China as an opportunity. And so to keep that consensus among the ASEAN 10 means that you have to go often for the lowest common denominator.
The only thing I would say to build on that set of two very, very good answers is that I think if we think about domestic politics again, and different domestic political actors and political factions inside Southeast Asian states, I mean, there's sort of two large points of view, I think, that come to the fore in many states in Southeast Asia. And you could sort of rank them in the sense that what I think a lot of people would prefer among many different political groupings is to have no one in the region in terms of great powers playing in that security space. Better to have them all stay out, right, and conduct their conflict somewhere else, right, keep them out completely. But if you can't have that, right, there's a second point of view that says if you can't have no one, then you have to have everyone, right, because if everyone is there, then they'll balance one another, right. You don't want only the United States in Southeast Asia, because then we're just going to be colony of the US, essentially, right, would be the argument. And you don't want only China there, because then China will just colonize the region itself and extend full influence over it in a very unilateral way. And so if you have everyone playing there, though, then they'll balance one another, at least they might. And that's preferable to just having one big power that's going to dominate. I wouldn't take a position on either of those, but I think those two schools of thought are important to remember when thinking about this. And so it's never as simple as just, oh, we prefer great power A to great power B, even for people who actually do, which I think, and I agree, it's not a complete unanimity of everyone prefers A to B or B to A. No, there's quite a bit of division, but whichever great power one prefers, I think there's a general agreement among many factions that it's a good idea not to have just one great power active or dominant in the region. Okay, with that, I think we can conclude the formal part of the program and invite everyone to stay on for a drinks reception to follow here in the same room. Thank you all very much. Thank you to both Laura and Ralf for excellent talks.